Hello student, welcome to this video. So in this video, I will be continuing to explain the lecture about Introduction to Cognitive Psychology. And in this video, we will first describe what is the mind, and then we will consider some of the history behind the cognitive psychology field. And finally, I will introduce a few of the ways that modern cognitive psychology have gone about studying the mind. And as we discussed before, that cognitive psychology is actually branch of psychology which study the mind. Okay, and the mind itself is a system that creates representation of the world, so we can act within it and achieve our goals. And this definition reflects the mind importance for our functioning as well as survival, and also provide the beginnings of a description of how the mind achieves these ends. And the mind itself creates a control mental function such as perception, attention, memory, emotion, language, deciding, thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and so on that we will discuss in each chapter of this course. And cognitive psychology's main objective is actually wants to determine the properties and the mechanism of the mind. And the mind question that wants to answer by cognitive psychology is what exactly are the properties of the mind? And then what are its characteristics? And how does it operate? And how it achieves what it does? And actually, the idea that the mind itself can be studied scientifically is a modern idea. So in the late 1800s, ideas of psychology were dominated by the thought that we cannot study the mind. Because why? The first one, the mind cannot study itself, and the second one, the mind cannot be measured. So how can you measure something that you cannot see or you cannot touch? However, thanks to a stubborn researchers who studying the mind, even though the environment are not supporting her, and the pioneer of those research is Franciscus Donders, who in 1868, that is 11 years before the founding of the Laboratory of Scientific Psychology Experiment, by Wilhelm Wundt. And Donders here, he conducted first experiments that nowadays called as a cognitive psychology experiment. So what is his experiment anyway? So actually Donders was interested in determining how long it takes for a person to make a decision. And he determined this by measuring the reaction time, or how long it takes to respond to a presentation of a stimulus. So this picture that you can see here is a modern version of Donders' experiments, using computer, because back then in Donders' time, there's no computer yet. So basically there are two stages of his experiment, and the first part of the experiment that he asked his participant to press a button upon presentation of a light. As you can see in this figure here, in the first one. And this called a simple reaction time task. You only need to press button when you see a light appear. And in the second part of the experiment, he made the task more difficult by presenting two lights, one in the left, one in the right. And the participants' task in this part of the experiment was to push one button when the light on the left was illuminated and another light was illuminated on the right side. And this is called as a choice reaction time task. So Donders actually was interested in determining how long it took for a person to make a decision. And the choice reaction time task added decision by requiring participants to first decide whether the left or the right light was illuminated, that's the first one, and then decide which button to push. So this diagram here on your right side is the diagram for this task. He changes the mental response to perceive the light and decide which button to push. And Donders reasoned that the difference in reaction time between the simple and the choice condition would indicate how long it took to make decision that led to pushing the correct button. And because the choice reaction time took 1/10 of a second longer than simple reaction time, then Donders concluded that the decision-making process took 1/10 of a second. And this research is very important because this is the first cognitive psychology experiments, and it illustrates something extremely significant about studying the mind, which is the mental processes. So perceiving the light and deciding which button to push is a mental process, right? So the mental process here, it cannot be measured directly, but it can be measured from the behavior. Yeah. So perceiving and decision making is a mental process that cannot be measured directly. But then how long the time that the participant took from the reaction time is the behavior, and it's measurable, but then it explains about the mental process. So this way in Donder's experiment is it's a principles that is important for all research in cognitive psychology in the future, which is that we measure the behavior to explain about the mental process that cannot be measured directly. And 11 years later, as I mentioned before, then Wilhelm Wundt, he founded the first lab of scientific psychology at the University of Leipzig, Germany. So his approach is called structuralism. So basically, it's our overall experience is determined by sensations. So by having those thought about structuralism, then Wundt wanted to make a periodic tables of the mind. He thought that he can make that almost similar with a periodic table in chemistry, the periodic table of the elements, but then he wants to make the periodic table of the mind or the basic sensation, yeah, that involve in creating experience. So he also thought to achieve this, he can use the method that he called as analytic introspection. It is a technique in which trained participants to describe their experiences and thought processes in response to stimuli. So for example, one experiment, Wundt asked the participants to describe their experience of hearing a 5-note chord played on the piano. And his question wants to answer was whether his participants were able to hear each of the individual notes that made up the chord. Yeah, so actually Wundt here made a substantial contribution to psychology by his commitment to studying behavior and the mind under controlled condition, which became a fundamental part of experimental psychology that is also conducting study inside a controlled condition or inside the laboratory. And meanwhile, at the University of Berlin, a German psychologist named Lee Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885 to 1913, he was also conducting an experiment in cognitive psychology, of course. It's almost the same time with Wundt. He was using another approach to measuring the properties of mind. So he wanted to determine the nature of memory and forgetting, specifically how rapidly information that is learned is lost over time. So differ from Wundt, Ebbinghaus here used a quantitative method for measuring the memory. So he's not using analytical introspection, So he used himself as a subject. He repeated lists of 30 nonsense syllables, such as the AX and etc. And he used nonsense syllables here, so the reason is so that his memory will not be influenced by the meaning of a particular word. So it's purely remembering something that he doesn't understand. So Ebbinghaus determined how long it took to learn a list for the first time. Then he delayed and then determined how long it took to relearn the list. So during the delay, he forgetting the syllabus, of course. He made errors when he tried to remember the list, but because he had retained something from his original learning, he relearned, he learned it for the first time. So Ebbinghaus used a measure called savings, as you can see in this figure. And it calculated as follows. So to determine how much forgotten after a particular delay, saving is the original time to learn the list minus time to relearn the list. And thus, if it took 1,000 seconds to learn the list for the first time and 400 seconds to relearn the list after the delay, then the saving would be 1,000 minus 400, which is 600. So longer delay result in smaller saving, of course. And according to Ebbinghaus, this reduction in saving provided a measure of forgetting, with smaller saving meaning more forgetting, right? And the plot of percent saving versus time, called a saving curve, as you can see here, shows that the memory drops rapidly for the first 2 days after the initial learning and the level off. So this curve was important because it demonstrates the memory could be quantified, yeah? And a function like the saving curve here could be used to describe a property of the mind. In this case, is ability to retain information or the memory. You should notice that although Ebbinghaus' saving method was different from Donder's reaction time, but both are measured behavior to determine the property of the mind. While Donders measured the reaction time, Ebbinghaus here measured the saving to explain about memory. And the next pioneers in cognitive psychology is William James, and he is one of the early American psychologists, and he taught Harvard first psychology course and made a significant observation about the mind, which in his textbook called Principle of Psychology in 1890, his observations were based not on the result of the experiment, but on observation about the operation of his own mind. And then he observed his own mind and research about the nature of attention. So his study will range for explaining thinking, consciousness, attention, memory, perception, imagination, and reasoning. And to summarize, here are the summary of early pioneers in cognitive psychology, from Donders to William James in the 1800s. So even though early psychology research that is conducted in laboratory tradition like Wundt's, the effort in studying the mind was actually like changed in the early 90s because of John Watson. Why? You might heard a name John Watson from your general psychology class, that he founded a behaviorism approach to psychology. Yeah, so he's the pioneer of behaviorism point of view. So he criticized the analytic introspection used by Wundt because of two reasons. The first one is from analytic introspection is extremely various, yeah, because it's subjective, because each person has different experience and opinion about their mind, about their thought process. And the results were also difficult to verify because they were interpreted in terms of invisible inner mental processes. So in response to what he perceived as deficiency in analytic introspection, Watson then proposed a new approach called the behaviorism. Yeah, as you may learn already in general psychology class. So he used observable behavior as means of study. Okay, so he only observed the behavior. He did not want to measure the mind. In other words, then, Watson here wanted to restrict psychology to behavioral data only, and rejected the idea of going beyond the data of behavior through observation to draw conclusion about unobservable mental event. So he refused to transfer or to use the data to explain about the mind. And Watson's most famous experiment was the Little Albert experiment, which he conducted with Rayner in 1920. So he investigated Albert, a 9-month-old boy, exposed to a loud noise, yeah, every time a rat came close to Albert. Okay, so after a few pairing, noise and rat, Albert then reacted to the rat by crawling away as rapidly as possible. It means that Albert was that now after the noise pairing, Albert now is terrifying of the rat. So what do you think about these experiments? First of all, in regards of the ethics, and the second one, what was the underlying mechanism of this behavior? Yeah, to modern experimental research in psychology, this method were clearly against the ethical reason. Yeah, it's no longer approved nowadays by studying a little kid that is exposed to something that is traumatic. And the second one, what was the underlying mechanism as you learned from your general psychology class, right? Watson here used classical conditioning in which pairing one stimulus with another. So previously neutral stimulus, the rat that previously Albert has no fear of it, yeah, as a natural stimulus, then it causes changes in the response to the neutral stimulus. So can you guys recall what famous experiment similar to this? They're also using classical conditioning, and by who? Yeah, when we recall from the general psychology class, Watson's inspiration for his experiment was Pavlov research in 1890s, yeah, that demonstrated classical conditioning in dogs. Pavlov pairing food with a bell caused dog to salivate to the sound of the bell. And Watson also used this classical conditioning to argue that behavior can be analyzed without any reference to the mind. And for Watson, what was going on inside Albert's head, either physiologically or mentally, was irrelevant, or it's not important. He cared only about how pairing one stimulus with another will affect Albert's behavior. And in the midst of behaviorism dominance of American psychologists, as you may also learn this from your general psychology class, Skinner here also provided another tool for studying the relationship between stimulus and response, yeah? Which ensure that this approach will dominate psychology for decades to come. Yeah, so behaviorism will take place in the 90s. And Skinner here introduced operant conditioning, a little bit different from classical conditioning, which focused on how behavior is strengthened by the presentation of positive reinforcers, yeah, such as food or social approval, or withdrawal of negative reinforcers, such as shock or social rejection. And the idea that behavior can be understood by studying stimulus relationship here is explained by the Skinner box, Skinner's experiments with the rat, which the rat given positive reinforcements and as well as negative reinforcements. So later on, to summary, this figure is a timeline showing that the initial studies of the mind and the rise of behaviorism here. But even as behaviorism was dominating psychology, events were occurring that were to lead the rebirth of the study of the mind or the cognitive psychology. And Tolman, thanks to Tolman in 1918 to 1945, he called himself as a behaviorist actually. But in reality, he was gone on the early cognitive psychologist research because he used behavior to infer mental processes. So Tolman here plays a rat in a maze like this, like you can see in this figure. And initially, the rat explored the maze, right, running up and down each of the alleys. And after this initial period of exploration, then the rat was placed at the point A, and food was placed at the point B. And the rat quickly learned to turn right at the intersection to obtain the food. So this is exactly what the behaviors would predict, right? Where's the food, pairing with the food, and then the rat will turn right. However, when Tolman, after taking precaution to be sure that the rat couldn't determine the location of the food based on the smell, so he placed the rat at point C, yeah, there is something interesting that happened there. So the rat turned left at the intersection to reach the food at point B. So Tolman's explanation of this result was that when the rat initially experienced the maze, it was developing a cognitive map. It's a conception within the rat's mind of the maze's layout. Interesting, but even though Tolman research has been doing research implicated on cognition, it is still difficult to accept because it violated the behaviorist idea, which is very strong in that era. Yeah. So it is difficult to accept that an internal process such as thinking or the cognitive maps inside the head of the rat, it's not an acceptable topic to study in that time. But a decade after that, in 1959, Noam Chomsky, he's not a psychologist, but he's a linguist, yeah, through his review of Skinner book on language development, he made a review of Skinner book about language development through operant conditioning. Chomsky pointed out that children learn language even though they have never been rewarded of learning that kind of word or sentence, such as, I hate you, mom, I hate you, dad. So this sentence were not rewarded or positively rewarded by their parents. But anyway, the children are still able to learn that kind of language. So Chomsky stated here that language is the product of the mind that is constructed rather than a result of reinforcement. But not only until the decade of 1915, the beginning of cognitive revolution, a shift in psychology from behaviorist to operation of the mind, it's finally occurred. So some of the reason of this rebirth of study of the mind is the development of technology, which is a digital computer is starting to produce, as well as the discussion about artificial intelligence topic. So in 1940s, the first digital computers developed, yeah. It's a huge machine, as you may recall. It's a huge machine. In the first time, it can analyze data and suggest a new way of thinking about mind. So as you can see in this figure, it's called the flow diagram for computer. Yeah. So in 1950, one characteristic of computer that is captured psychologists' attention is how the computer process information in stages. As you can see that the computer here in this figure, they using this stage approach, yeah. And some psychologists then propose information processing approach as well from learning from the process from the computer. So an approach that traces sequences of mental operation involved in cognition. And Broadbent in 1958 then proposed the diagram of attention, as you can see in this figure. Start from the stimulus, there's a filter, detector, and it's stored in our memory. And this is about the computer, digital computer, and about the artificial intelligence. So in early 1950s as well, there were the first conference, yeah, in to discuss about intelligent behavior conducted by McCarthy. He is a young professor that has an idea, would it be possible to program computers to mimic the operation of the human mind? Yeah, and then later on, researchers as well called Simon and Newell created a program called logic theories, and they're able to create a proof on mathematical theorems that involve principle of logic. So, however, even years after the conference, the first conference of artificial intelligence, yeah, a textbook in psychology history made no mention about cognitive approach yet. Yeah, not until 1967, when Nasr, he published a textbook entitled Cognitive Psychology. So actually this book by Nasr is the grandfather of cognitive psychology that you've been read now. Not only until in 1967. Finally, the cognitive psychology is mentioned here. Later on, a big step toward the study of higher mental processes about cognitive psychology was the research conducted by Richard Atkinson and Richard Shiffrin in 1968. They introduced this model of memory, or the flow of information in the memory system as progressing through 3 stages, as you can see in this figure. Started with sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And this this model is introduced 1 year after Nasr book in cognitive psychology. And continuing that in 1972 and 1985, Tolfing here, he can continue the study to develop the model of long-term memory that consists of episodic memory, semantic memory, and procedural memory. And while researchers here were working to understand memory and other cognitive function by doing behavioral experiments, something else was happening. And this is also an important breakpoint as well. Physiological research, which we will see in chapter 2 after this, had been making advances since 1800s actually. It was providing important insights into the behind the scenes activities in the nervous system that actually creates the mind. Yeah, as you may learn from this biopsychology class as well. So it's the physiological explanation of cognition, is studying the neuropsychology, in which studying the behavior of people with the brain damage, so we can explain or providing insights into the function of different parts of the brain and the cognitive function of the brain as well. And electrophysiology also, it is measuring the electrical responses of the nervous system. It made us possible to listen the activity of single neuron in our brain, yeah. And most electrophysiology research was done in animals. And both neuropsychology and electrophysiology have provided important insight into the physiological basis of the mind. But perhaps the most significant physiological advances wasn't to come until a decade after Nasr's book in 1967. It is when the technique of brain imaging was introduced. So the procedure called the positron emission tomography, or PET, and the functional magnetic resonance imaging or the fMRI is introduced to give us the insight or the visual explanation about explaining about the cognitive function in our brain. And how has the cognitive psychology evolved since the Nasr book in 1967? So as I have already mentioned before, current cognitive psychology involves more sophisticated flow diagrams of the mind, right? As the as the research progress, yeah. and also the consideration of higher mental processes, and also the large amount of physiological research. Yeah, so and researchers began taking research out of the laboratory. So most early research was done inside the laboratories, right? Because of the nature of starting from the laboratory nature. With participants sitting in one place looking at flash stimuli that was done by donors, right? But it became clear that to fully understand the mind, we have to also study um, what happens when a person is moving through environment and acting on it. And it is impossible that the research still conducted inside the lab. So modern cognitive psychology, therefore, features an increasing amount of research of cognition in real-world situations. So researchers here also realize that humans are not blank states, yeah, that just accept and store information. So that's why the researchers began doing experiments that demonstrated the importance of knowledge for cognition. So for example, here is the experiment by Palmer that you can see in this picture. It was used by Palmer in 1975 to illustrate how our knowledge about the environment can influence our perception. So Palmer first presented a context of scenes such as the kitchen here, as you can see, and then briefly flashed one of the target pictures on the right side. So when Palmer asked observers to identify the object in the target picture, they correctly identify an object like the loaf of bread, yeah, which is appropriate picture that is related to the kitchen, right? So the bread was like 80% correct of the time, but for the drum and the mailbox, it's only 40% correct of the time. So apparently, farmer observers were using their knowledge, their prior knowledge of objects that are likely to be found in the kitchen to help them perceive the briefly flash both bread. So it's the end for now. So briefly, from this lecture, you now know some researchers began doing research in cognitive psychology experiment in the 19th century and so on. Yeah? So within this lecture, you have been oriented to the field of cognitive psychology, but we will continue our discussion into the next chapter to describing the properties of our mind in its chapter of this case. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.